My name is Mia Stone. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound gentle, but often mean something else. Stable, responsible, the calm one. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Seattle, where I work as a clinical data analyst. My job is to look at patterns most people miss. Numbers, inconsistencies, timing, the things that don't scream for attention, but quietly shape outcomes. It's meticulous work, solitary work, the kind of work that requires patience. People have always mistaken my patience for passivity. In my family, I was the daughter who didn't cause scenes, the one who handled paperwork, the one who sat beside hospital beds and asked precise questions while others cried. I don't cry easily in front of people. I observe. I remember. After my mother died when I was 22, it was just my father and me for a long time, until he remarried. And when he did, I stepped back. Not dramatically, not resentfully, just carefully. My stepmother entered our lives like someone who understood how to belong quickly. She was warm in public, efficient in private, the kind of woman who corrected small details with a smile. Most people admired her organization, her devotion. I admired her attention to timing. This story is not about revenge. It's not a courtroom thriller or a dramatic explosion of secrets. There are no shouting matches in rainstorms. There are no villains in black coats. It's about something quieter. It's about noticing a dosage change no one else questioned. It's about finding empty medication vials that didn't match prescription records. It's about discovering a will that had been drafted months before my father ever became seriously ill. And it's about what you do when the person who underestimated you assumes you will remain silent. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't dramatize grief or pretend I was fearless. I wasn't. I was confused. I was devastated. I doubted myself more than once, but I was not careless. This is the story of how invisibility became leverage, how patience became protection, and how sometimes the most powerful move is not confrontation, but documentation. If you've ever felt dismissed because you don't raise your voice, if you've ever watched something feel wrong before you had proof, then you might understand why I stayed quiet, until I didn't. Before I begin, let me tell you who I was to them. If you asked my stepmother who I was, she would have smiled politely and said, "Mia's very capable. She likes to handle things." Handle things. It sounds complimentary. It isn't. In our family dynamic, handling things meant paperwork, insurance calls, prescription refills, sitting in waiting rooms, explaining medical terminology in simple language while pretending I wasn't listening to the subtle corrections she'd make afterward. "She worries too much," my stepmother would say lightly, resting her hand on my father's shoulder. "Mia always thinks something's wrong." My father would chuckle. "That's because she's thorough." Thorough. Another word that feels kind but keeps you in a box. When my father's heart condition began worsening, I naturally slipped into my role. I attended cardiology appointments when work allowed. I asked about dosage ranges. I took notes. Not obsessively, just carefully. I always had. But over time, I noticed a shift. My stepmother began insisting she would manage the medication schedule. "It's too stressful for Mia," she'd tell relatives. "She gets anxious." I don't get anxious. I get attentive. Family friends saw her as devoted. She posted filtered photos of hospital bracelets and captioned them with quotes about love and endurance. She organized meal trains. She fielded phone calls. She cried publicly. I was the quiet daughter in the corner, laptop open, reviewing discharge summaries. And slowly something subtle began happening. Information stopped flowing through me. Prescriptions were picked up without my knowledge. Follow-up calls were made while I was busy. When I asked about changes, she'd respond with gentle dismissal. "Oh, it's the same. Don't overthink it." But I've built my entire career on overthinking. At family dinners, I was introduced as Mia, the numbers girl, the practical one, the unemotional one, the one who didn't need reassurance because I was strong. Strength is often just unacknowledged grief. I never confronted her. Not then. Because technically, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was organized, present, efficient. There was no obvious hostility, no cruel remarks, only a steady repositioning of influence. My father trusted her. That part mattered, and I told myself something simple. If she's helping him, that's what counts. But invisibility has a strange side effect. When people believe you're passive, they stop hiding their assumptions. They assume you won't verify. They assume you won't cross-check. They assume you don't keep records. They assume your silence is emptiness. I didn't argue when she took control of his medication chart binder. I didn't push when she insisted on being the primary contact at the pharmacy. I stepped back, and I watched. Because the thing about being underestimated is this. It gives you time. Time to observe patterns. Time to notice inconsistencies. Time to ask yourself a quiet question. Is this devotion or control? At that stage, I didn't have answers. I only had a feeling, a small, persistent friction under the surface of normalcy. And in families, friction is often explained away as stress. So I said nothing, for now. The first time I felt something shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a missed pill. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even a raised voice. It was a Tuesday afternoon at the pharmacy. I had left work early to pick up one of my father's prescriptions. The refill reminder had popped up in the hospital's shared patient portal. A portal I still had access to because I'd been managing his care long before he remarried. When I arrived, the pharmacist looked confused. That one was already picked up yesterday, she said gently. I paused. By who? She checked the screen. Spouse on file. Of course. I thanked her and walked back to my car, not angry, just recalibrating. I sent a simple text. Hey, I was at the pharmacy. I didn't realize you'd picked up Dad's beta blocker already. She replied within seconds. Yes, I handled it. No need for you to worry about these things anymore, sweetheart. Sweetheart, that word had started appearing more often. I let it go. It was small, harmless even. Except it wasn't the pickup that bothered me. It was the dosage. When I logged into the portal that evening, I noticed the milligram strength listed on the refill was slightly higher than what I had written in my black notebook 2 weeks prior. Not dangerously higher, just adjusted. Medication adjustments happen. Cardiologists modify plans. That's normal. What wasn't normal was that I hadn't heard about it. So I called my father casually. Hey, Dad, how are you feeling on the new dosage? A pause. What new dosage? Another small cut. He sounded genuinely confused. He said he was taking what she handed him. He trusted that she had confirmed everything with the doctor. And maybe she had. But when I asked if he'd had a follow-up appointment, he said no. Not since the one I attended. I hung up with a polite love you and sat very still at my kitchen table. In my line of work, small discrepancies are never ignored. You don't assume malice. You assume an error. You verify. So the next morning during my break, I called the cardiology office. The nurse checked the records. There was no documented dosage increase in the last appointment, she said. Let me look. Oh, it appears a phone authorization was called in. By the physician, I asked. It says verbal authorization received, no detailed note attached. Verbal authorization without documentation. Technically possible, but unusual, especially for heart medication. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't even mention it to my stepmother. Instead, I began a second column in my notebook. Column 1, official record. Column 2, what was physically in the house? A week later, I visited unexpectedly on a Sunday morning. I brought pastries. I smiled. I hugged her. While she was in the kitchen, I asked my father, lightly, if I could check his pill organizer, just to make sure everything lined up. She returned to the living room faster than I expected. Oh, I've already sorted those, she said, tone pleasant but firm. Mia, you don't need to double-check me. It was the first time there was steel beneath the softness. My father laughed awkwardly. You two are worse than my doctors. I smiled, just habit, but I saw it then. A flash in her expression, not fear, not guilt. Territory. From that day forward, access became subtly restricted. Medication bottles were no longer left on the counter. The binder I once maintained disappeared from its usual shelf, and when I asked harmless logistical questions, the responses grew shorter. You're overthinking. It's handled. Trust me, the first small cut isn't painful because of what it does. It's painful because of what it reveals. It reveals that someone prefers you uninformed, and once you see that preference, you can't unsee it. I still said nothing, but I began saving screenshots, quietly. The human mind has a remarkable ability to normalize discomfort, not because we're weak, but because we crave stability more than we crave truth. After that first discrepancy, I told myself a story that felt responsible. Maybe she was trying to lighten my load. Maybe she thought I needed distance. Maybe she believed she was protecting both of us from the stress of my father's declining health. And if I'm honest, part of me wanted to believe that. Grief from losing my mother had already taught me what it feels like to lose a parent slowly. I didn't want to relive that hypervigilance. So when my stepmother gradually repositioned herself as the sole gatekeeper of my father's medication and appointments, I allowed it. On the surface, everything looked devoted. She attended every checkup. She sat closest to the doctor. She answered questions quickly, sometimes before my father could. If I tried to clarify something, she would gently reframe it. Mia worries because she works in healthcare, she'd explain, smiling at the physician. She sees worst-case scenarios all day. The implication was subtle. I lacked emotional objectivity. Doctors nodded sympathetically. They've seen anxious daughters before. I wasn't anxious, I was precise. But precision can be socially inconvenient. At family gatherings, I noticed how narratives shifted. My stepmother would recount stories about adjusting medication schedules late at night, about how exhausted she was managing everything alone. Alone. I was sitting 3 feet away. When relatives asked if I was helping, she would squeeze my hand affectionately. "Oh, Mia has such a demanding job. I don't want to burden her." Burden. The word sounded generous. It wasn't. Each time I offered to review prescriptions or attend appointments, she declined with a softness that made refusal feel like kindness. "It's under control. Rest. I've got him." My father began echoing her language. "Let her handle it, honey," he told me once. "You've done enough." That sentence stayed with me. "You've done enough." It was as if my involvement had an expiration date I hadn't been told about. I began noticing other small patterns. Pharmacy pickups always occurred on days I was working late. Appointment summaries were no longer uploaded to the shared portal immediately. When I asked for copies, I'd receive them days later, sometimes incomplete. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable, just friction, the kind that makes you question your own instincts. And that's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition. When someone consistently minimizes your questions, eventually you start minimizing them yourself. Maybe I am overthinking. Maybe this is what support looks like. Maybe stepping back is mature. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: my father's fatigue. He seemed more tired than usual, not just physically, cognitively. His responses were slower. He would forget whether he'd taken his evening pills. Once he asked me quietly if the dosage had changed. "I think they're stronger," he murmured. "I feel heavier." He said it casually, as if commenting on the weather. I asked if the doctor explained why. "He said it's standard progression," my stepmother answered from across the room before my father could finish. Standard progression. It's a phrase that can hide anything. I nodded, outwardly compliant. Inside, something was reorganizing. If this were truly a medical necessity, documentation would support it. If it were progression, there would be clear notes, clear rationale. My career has taught me something critical. Patterns tell the truth, even when people don't. So I stopped asking emotionally framed questions. Instead, I shifted to logistical ones. What's the refill interval now? Did they switch brands? Was that a new prescribing physician? Each time I received partial answers, or vague ones, or irritation disguised as patience. The disrespect wasn't loud, it was systematic. And that's when I understood something quietly unsettling. She wasn't trying to push me away because I was unnecessary. She was trying to push me away because I was observant. I didn't confront her. I adjusted. Because when someone starts treating your awareness as a threat, you don't argue. You document. There's a moment in every shifting dynamic when you realize you've been cast in a role without auditioning for it. Mine was the reliable one. The one who shows up. The one who absorbs tension. The one who makes everything easier for everyone else. But not the one who decides. I began to see it clearly one evening when we were sitting at my father's dining table. Paperwork was spread out, insurance forms, supplemental coverage documents, and a long-term care policy renewal. Naturally, the stack was slid toward me. "Mia understands this stuff," my stepmother said brightly. "She's so good with details." And I was. I reviewed everything line by line. I flagged minor discrepancies in billing codes. I corrected a misreported prescription charge. I even found an overpayment they were owed. They both thanked me, but when the conversation shifted to medical planning, power of attorney updates, emergency directives, the papers were gently gathered back toward her. "We've already discussed that," she said, tone smooth. "It's handled." Handled. I noticed my father didn't elaborate. He looked tired, trusting, passive in a way he never used to be. I had been assigned the role of executor without authority. Capable but peripheral, useful but not central. It was subtle and socially defensible. No one was excluding me outright. No one was hostile. I was simply redirected. When the extended family asked about my father's care, my stepmother answered, If I added clarification, she'd nod politely and then summarize over me. Yes, that's what I said. Sometimes she'd call me after appointments, not to inform, but to narrate. I told the doctor exactly what you would have asked, she'd say. See, we're a team. But teams share access. I started noticing physical changes in the house, too. The medication drawer that used to sit half open was now locked. The small metal safe in the study, one I'd never seen use, began appearing on the desk more often. One afternoon, I arrived early and found her reorganizing documents into labeled folders. When she saw me, she smiled warmly and closed one of them a little too quickly. You don't need to stress about estate things, she said. Your father and I are making sure everything's clear. Estate things. The phrase hung in the air. Clear for who? I asked lightly. For everyone, she replied. My father reached for my hand. Sweetheart, you'll be taken care of. That wasn't what I'd asked, but it revealed something important. In their minds, my role wasn't a decision maker. It wasn't a protector. It wasn't an equal stakeholder. It was the recipient, grateful beneficiary, quiet daughter, cooperative adult child, the one who accepts what she's given. And here's the thing about being perceived as non-threatening. People stop disguising control as collaboration. They assume your compliance. I could have pushed harder then, demanded to see documents, insisted on transparency, but direct confrontation would have reframed me exactly how she'd been positioning me. Anxious, distrustful, difficult. So I did something else. I leaned into the role. I became even more helpful. I reviewed every insurance statement. I updated contact spreadsheets. I offered to digitize old records for organization. And in doing so, I gained access to more than she realized. Because when people believe you're operating inside the role they assigned you, they rarely notice when you quietly step outside it. I wasn't fighting for control. I was mapping it. And slowly, I began to understand something uncomfortable. This wasn't about caretaking. It was about consolidation. And consolidation requires one thing above all else: isolation. The shift didn't happen in a hospital room. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening in my father's study, with sunlight fading across the carpet and the faint ticking of the wall clock behind me. He had fallen asleep in his recliner after dinner. My stepmother was upstairs on a call. I could hear her voice drifting faintly through the ceiling. Controlled. Measured. I was alone in the study because I'd volunteered to scan a few old tax records. Another harmless task. Another way to remain useful. The metal safe was on the desk again. It wasn't locked. That detail alone wouldn't have meant anything months earlier. But by then, I had learned to pay attention to small lapses. I didn't open it immediately. I sat there first, listening to my own breathing, to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, to the rhythm of a house that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Then I opened it. Inside were neatly stacked folders, insurance policies, property deeds, a sealed envelope labeled Updated Will. Updated. My father had mentioned reviewing paperwork, but never specifically updating the will. I wasn't looking for inheritance. I was looking for timing. I slid the envelope halfway out, not to read every page, just to glance at the date. It had been drafted nearly 6 months earlier, 6 months before his condition worsened significantly, 6 months before the dosage changes, 6 months before she began repositioning herself as the sole gatekeeper. I felt something inside me become very still. The date itself wasn't proof of wrongdoing. People update their wills all the time, but timing is rarely accidental. I carefully returned the envelope exactly as I found it. Then I noticed something else tucked beneath the folders. A small pharmacy bag, empty. Inside were 2 clear vials, unlabeled, clean. No prescription stickers, no printed dosage instructions. They weren't standard packaging from our local pharmacy. I knew that because I had picked up refills there for years. They were secondary containers. Transferring medication from one vial to another isn't illegal by itself. People use pill organizers, travel containers. But why keep the empties in a locked safe? I didn't panic. I didn't jump to conclusions. I took a photo, not dramatically, not shakily, just a single steady image. Then I placed everything back exactly as it had been. The angle of the folders, the position of the envelope, the orientation of the vials inside the bag. When I left the study, my stepmother was descending the stairs. You're quiet, she said, studying me. Just focused, I replied. She smiled, but her eyes searched my face for something. I realized then that the dynamic had changed. Not outwardly, but internally. Up until that moment, I had been reacting, observing inconsistencies, logging patterns. But this was different. This was preparation. A will was drafted months before the illness accelerated. Unmarked, empty vials stored with legal documents. Verbal dosage authorizations without written notes. Individually, they were fragments. Together, they formed a silhouette. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I didn't even ask my father about the will. Instead, I drove home that night with an unfamiliar clarity settling over me. This wasn't about family tension. This was about timing, documentation, and control of narrative. And I understood something quietly irreversible. If something happened to my father suddenly, the story would already be written, and I would be cast in the role assigned to me. Concerned but uninformed, grieving but compliant. That was the day I stopped hoping I was wrong, and started preparing for the possibility that I wasn't. After that night in the study, my silence changed. Before it had been hesitant, now it was intentional. There's a difference between being quiet because you doubt yourself and being quiet because you are collecting something. I didn't alter my behavior dramatically. That would have drawn attention. Instead, I softened it. I asked fewer direct questions. I expressed more gratitude. I complimented her organization. "You've really streamlined everything," I told my stepmother one afternoon, while she arranged pill bottles on the counter. She looked pleased. It's important to stay ahead of these things. Ahead. The word echoed in my mind. I watched her measure my father's evening dose that night. She worked with confidence, opening capsules, tapping tablets into her palm before placing them into his pill organizer. "Doctor adjusted slightly," she said casually without prompting. I nodded. Of course. But I had already memorized the milligram imprint on the original tablets months earlier. Years of working with clinical trial supplies had trained my eyes to recognize even minor differences in pill size and color. The tablet she handed him looked denser. Not dramatically so, just enough. I didn't react. Later that week, I logged into the shared patient portal again. The dosage listed there hadn't changed. I compared timestamps. The pharmacy refill record showed a slightly higher quantity dispensed than the prescription indicated. It could have been a clerical error. It could have been rounding. It could have been nothing. But silence allowed me something confrontation would have destroyed. Proximity. When people believe you're no longer a threat, they relax their guard. She began discussing plans more openly around me. "We need to make sure everything is settled," she told a neighbor within my hearing range. "His condition is unpredictable." Unpredictable. That wasn't the word his cardiologist had used. My father, meanwhile, grew more subdued. His fatigue deepened. Some days he seemed over-medicated, slightly disoriented, slow to respond. I began visiting at irregular hours, dropping by with groceries, bringing dinner unexpectedly. Each time I made small observations. Was the pill organizer filled differently? Were there additional vials in the cabinet? Were refill dates aligning with prescription intervals? And each time I recorded quietly in my black leather notebook. I also began doing something more strategic. At work, during lunch breaks, I reviewed standard prescribing protocols for his specific heart medication. I studied average titration timelines. I compared them to the pace of his adjustments. They didn't align. Not catastrophically, not outrageously, just enough to raise a question. And here's what I learned in that period. Silence is not the absence of action. It is the presence of preparation. My stepmother mistook my calm demeanor for surrender. She resumed calling me sweetheart. She even began asking for my help with minor tasks again. Small enough to keep me involved, not significant enough to give me influence. That balance was intentional. She wanted me close but not informed. So I played the part she had written for me. Attentive daughter, helpful analyst, non-threatening observer. But internally, a line had been crossed. If my father's medication was being altered beyond medical guidance, if a will had been drafted strategically before health decline accelerated, then this wasn't just family tension. It was premeditation. I didn't know the full picture yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. When the time came, emotion would not protect me. Evidence would. And I was almost ready to find it. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After choosing silence deliberately, I shifted from passive observation to structured documentation. Not obsessively, not recklessly, methodically. At work, I had access to anonymized prescribing data. Nothing that violated privacy laws, nothing tied directly to my father, but enough to understand statistical norms, average titration increments, standard maximum thresholds, red flags that typically trigger mandatory review. I created a private spreadsheet at home. Column 1, official prescription dosage and dates from the patient portal. Column 2, pharmacy, Refill quantities and timestamps. Column 3. Physical observations from the house. Pill appearance, count discrepancies, packaging changes. Column 4. Behavioral symptoms. Fatigue level, cognitive shifts, blood pressure readings when I could casually check them. It wasn't emotional, it was analytical. And slowly a pattern emerged. The official records showed gradual conservative adjustments. Textbook pacing. But the refill quantities sometimes exceeded what the documented dosage required. Not always. Just enough to create surplus. Surplus medication doesn't disappear on its own. I needed something stronger than a feeling. So I did something subtle. I offered to help declutter the study one Saturday afternoon. My stepmother hesitated, then agreed. She watched me sort old tax forms, outdated warranties, and instruction manuals. I kept my movements transparent and predictable. The safe wasn't visible that day, but the small filing cabinet beneath the desk was. While organizing labeled folders, I found carbon copies of pharmacy receipts. Not the standard printed ones from our local pharmacy, but smaller slips from a secondary location across town, a pharmacy my father had never mentioned. The dates aligned with the unexplained surplus. I didn't take them. I photographed them discreetly when she stepped out to answer a phone call. Still no confrontation, still no accusation, but my internal certainty solidified. The empty vials I'd seen earlier, they likely originated there. That evening, I drove past the secondary pharmacy. Small, independent, less digital oversight than larger chains. I didn't go inside, not yet. Instead, I began another layer of preparation. I consulted, hypothetically, with a colleague who specialized in compliance auditing. I framed it as a fictional scenario, a family member managing another's medication with verbal authorizations and undocumented adjustments. What would trigger an investigation? I asked casually over coffee. She didn't hesitate. Inconsistent dispensing records, overlapping prescriptions, sudden health decline without documented rationale. All three were quietly forming in my spreadsheet. Meanwhile, my stepmother grew more confident. She began discussing estate logistics more openly in front of me. "We're finalizing everything soon," she said one night while clearing dishes. "It's important that transitions are smooth." Transitions? My father wasn't terminal. His condition was serious, yes, but manageable with proper medication. Yet her language suggested inevitability. What she never noticed was this. The more she spoke, the more precise my notes became. She assumed my calm meant acceptance. She assumed my lack of confrontation meant ignorance. But invisibility can be strategic camouflage. One afternoon, while she was at a yoga class, I stopped by under the pretense of dropping off groceries. My father was resting upstairs. In the kitchen cabinet, behind the standard prescription bottles, I found 2 additional containers without pharmacy labels, the same type I'd seen in the safe. One still had a residue of small white tablets. I counted the remaining pills. Then I checked the official dosage schedule in the portal on my phone. There was no legitimate reason for the quantity discrepancy. I didn't remove anything. I simply photographed, logged, and replaced. That was the moment I stopped doubting my instincts entirely. Because patterns don't lie. And someone who plans ahead rarely anticipates the quiet person mapping their timeline. What they never noticed wasn't that I was suspicious. It was that I was building a case. Not for revenge. For truth. And truth, when documented properly, doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be presented at the right time. The truth rarely arrives as a thunderclap. It arrives as confirmation. By the time I walked into the independent pharmacy across town, I wasn't searching for drama. I was searching for alignment, or misalignment, between records and reality. I dressed simply, neutral, professional, but unremarkable. I introduced myself as the daughter of a patient who had recently filled prescriptions there. The pharmacist on duty was older and careful with his words. "I'm just trying to reconcile some insurance statements," I said lightly. There seemed to be duplicate fills. He hesitated, then he checked the system. "Yes," he said slowly. "We've filled several prescriptions under your father's name over the past few months." "Several? Were they transferred from his primary pharmacy?" I asked. "No transfer request on file," he replied. He printed transaction summaries when I explained that I needed them for insurance reconciliation. They weren't detailed medical charts, just dispensing records with dates and quantities. The quantities were higher than the official prescriptions documented in the hospital portal, significantly higher. But here's what mattered most. The prescribing physician listed wasn't his cardiologist. It was a general practitioner he hadn't seen in over a year. My voice remained steady. Was there documentation of in-person visits? The pharmacist scanned again. Verbal authorizations, multiple. Verbal, no electronic follow-up notes attached. I thanked him. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. When I stepped outside into the cold air, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Not anger, not vindication. Clarity. The empty vials in the safe. The surplus medication is in the cabinet. The unexplained fatigue. The will was drafted months before the illness accelerated. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was coordination. I drove home and laid out everything on my dining table. Screenshots, photographs, refill logs, timestamps, copies of dispensing records. Side by side, the timeline told a story more eloquent than emotion ever could. 6 months ago, the update will be drafted. 5 months ago, secondary pharmacy fills begin. 4 months ago, documented dosage increases without proper physician notes. 3 months ago, observable decline in energy and cognition. 2 months ago, estate conversations intensify. And beneath it all, a consistent narrative of standard progression. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes when denial is no longer available to you. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I asked myself a single question. What outcome am I trying to prevent? Because this wasn't about inheritance. If it were only about money, confrontation might have been impulsive. This was about my father's life, and about preventing a story from being finalized before it needed to be. The will I had glimpsed. I still hadn't read its contents fully. But its timing suggested intent. Medication, when improperly dosed, doesn't leave obvious fingerprints. It leaves fatigue, confusion, plausible decline, the kind people accept as inevitable, the kind doctors can attribute to disease progression, the kind families grieve without questioning. I realized then that if something happened suddenly, the paperwork would already be in place. The narrative is prepared. The dosage history is defensible enough to blur suspicion, unless someone intervened. Quietly, strategically, legally. The private reveal wasn't discovering betrayal. It was discovering leverage. Because once documentation exists outside a controlled household environment, control begins to fracture. I gathered the copies neatly and placed them into a separate folder. Then I opened my laptop and drafted an email. Not to her, to an attorney, one who specializes in medical guardianship and estate irregularities. I didn't send it yet, but the draft sat there waiting, because now for the first time I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. There are moments in life when you realize that no option will keep everything intact. That was where I stood. On my dining table sat 2 organized folders. One contained copies of dispensing records from the secondary pharmacy. The other held screenshots from the hospital portal, timestamps, and my own documentation of physical symptoms. I had 3 choices. The first was confrontation. I could walk into that house, place the evidence on the table, and demand an explanation. I could ask why prescriptions were being filled without proper documentation. I could ask why surplus medication existed. I could ask why a will had been drafted before any significant health acceleration. But confrontation would give her time. Time to adjust narratives. Time to explain away discrepancies. Time to frame me as emotionally unstable or paranoid. The second option was withdrawal. I could step back completely, let events unfold, protect my own peace, accept that families are complicated and sometimes control shifts quietly. I could tell myself that maybe I was misinterpreting intention, but withdrawal would risk something irreversible. If dosage manipulation was intentional, even slightly, the damage wouldn't pause, because I felt uncomfortable intervening. The third option was escalation, not a dramatic escalation, no police at the door. Strategic escalation, medical review, legal oversight, independent verification, the irreversible kind. Because once you involve external authority in family matters, there is no going back to polite dinners and soft smiles. You redraw the entire relationship. I thought about my father, about the way his hands trembled slightly when holding a coffee cup, about how he'd once whispered that he felt heavier on his medication, about the trust in his voice when he said, "She handles it." He trusted her, and I understood something painful in that realization. Protecting him might mean dismantling that trust, not through accusation, through scrutiny. I opened the draft email to the attorney and reread it carefully. It was factual, detached, structured, no emotional language, no assumptions, just documented inconsistencies and a request for confidential consultation. Then I drafted a second message, this one to his cardiologist's office. I requested a comprehensive medication review appointment, citing concerns about refill discrepancies and symptom progression. I asked for confirmation of all verbal authorizations issued in the past 6 months. I didn't copy my stepmother. Not yet. My finger hovered over the send button longer than I expected. Because this wasn't just about paperwork. This was about altering the trajectory of a plan that may have already been set in motion. Once the review began, the secondary pharmacy records would surface. The undocumented authorizations would be examined. Dosage quantities would be reconciled. If everything were innocent, transparency would protect everyone. If it wasn't, silence would no longer be an option. I pressed send. Both emails. The sound was almost anticlimactic, a soft digital whoosh. But in that small sound, something shifted permanently. I had chosen the irreversible path. Not revenge, not exposure for humiliation, accountability. Because quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about refusing to let harm continue simply because it's subtle. And now the process had begun. They just didn't know it yet. The strange thing about setting something in motion is that the world rarely reacts immediately. You expect thunder, you get ordinary days. The morning after I sent the emails, I went to work as usual, reviewed data sets, attended a compliance meeting, answered routine messages. No alarm sounded in my personal life. But beneath the surface, systems were shifting. The cardiologist's office responded first. A nurse emailed me, confirming a medication reconciliation appointment for the following week. She also noted that several verbal dosage authorizations would need written verification before the visit. Written verification. That meant someone would have to produce documentation that didn't exist, or admit it hadn't been properly recorded. The attorney's assistant replied later that afternoon, offering a confidential consultation and requesting that I bring any relevant prescription and estate documentation. Estate documentation. That word steadied me. I didn't tell my stepmother about either development. Instead, I adjusted my visits. I stopped dropping by unpredictably and began scheduling them again. Politely, transparently, if oversight was about to increase. I didn't want her altering her behavior in anticipation of scrutiny. When I visited 2 days later, everything appeared normal. Too normal. The medication drawer was tidy. The extra unlabeled vials I had previously seen were gone, replaced by standard pharmacy bottles. I didn't react. I asked my father how he was feeling. Better, he said. Less foggy. Less foggy. That detail registered immediately. My stepmother smiled. We simplified the schedule. It was getting confusing. Simplified. I nodded thoughtfully. That's good. But when I discreetly checked the pill organizer while she stepped outside to take a call, the tablets looked different again. Closer to the original imprint I remembered months ago. Dosage reduction, without explanation. That told me everything I needed to know. Someone had noticed movement in the system, not because I confronted them, but because institutional checks had begun quietly requesting verification. At work the following day, I received a voicemail from the cardiology nurse asking to clarify which pharmacy had been dispensing certain refills. They were tracing the records. The beauty of institutional review is that it doesn't accuse. It asks. And when you ask enough precise questions, inconsistencies reveal themselves. Meanwhile, estate matters progress silently as well. During my consultation, the attorney reviewed the timeline I had assembled. She didn't express outrage. She didn't dramatize. She asked 3 calm questions. Was your father cognitively evaluated before the will update? Were there witnesses independent of the household? Were medication changes documented appropriately at the time of signing? I didn't know the answers to all 3, but I knew they needed to be verified. The attorney suggested something simple yet powerful. Request a formal capacity assessment and independent medical review before any estate changes were finalized or executed. Not an accusation, a safeguard. That afternoon, I drafted a polite professional email to my stepmother and father, suggesting that, given his recent fatigue and adjustments, it might be wise to schedule a comprehensive medication and cognitive review for everyone's peace of mind. I framed it as a concern, because it was. When I hit send this time, I wasn't anxious. I was composed. I had already moved the pieces necessary to ensure that even if I were dismissed, the review process would continue. The shift was subtle, but it was irreversible. For the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, not anger, control. Not over people, over process. And once the process is in motion, narratives begin to crack. They just hadn't realized it yet. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive as tension in a room that used to feel rehearsed. 2 days after I sent the peace of mind email, my stepmother called me. Not texted. Don't casually mention it during dinner. Called. Her voice was measured. Mia, I received your message about a cognitive and medication review. That seems unnecessary. I kept my tone steady. It's routine when there are dosage adjustments and fatigue. It protects everyone. A pause. We've already handled his care responsibly, she replied. I know, I said softly. That's why formal documentation shouldn't be a problem. Silence again. It wasn't anger I heard. It was a recalculation. Later that week, the cardiologist's office contacted them directly to confirm refill sources. I know this because my father mentioned it casually when I visited. They're asking about pharmacies, he said, frowning slightly. I thought everything was simple. My stepmother interjected quickly. It's just insurance confusion. But her movements were sharper that afternoon. She cleaned the kitchen twice, rearranged the medication drawer, checked her phone frequently. That's when I understood something important. When scrutiny enters a system built on subtle control, the first reaction isn't an explosion. It's instability. Within days, small fractures began appearing. The secondary pharmacy called to clarify a refill that had been requested, but now needed updated physician documentation. The cardiologist's office requested written confirmation of verbal dosage increases before continuing the current schedule. And then the appointment happened, the comprehensive medication review. I attended at my father's request. My stepmother sat closest to the physician as usual, posture straight, expression composed. The cardiologist began calmly. We're reconciling medication records. There appear to be additional fills from another pharmacy that we don't have documentation for. My father looked confused. Another pharmacy? My stepmother responded immediately. We were comparing prices. Understood, the doctor said. But the dosage quantities exceed what was prescribed here. That's when I saw it. Not panic, not guilt, but a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Exposure. The doctor turned to my father. Have you been taking more than the documented dose? He shook his head slowly. I take what's given to me. The room went very still. No accusations were made. No one raised their voice. But the dynamic shifted. From that moment forward, medication adjustments were placed under strict electronic authorization only. No verbal modifications. No secondary fills without direct transfer. Institutional oversight had tightened. And within a week, something else changed. My father's energy improved. Subtly. Gradually. He was still ill. Heart disease doesn't reverse overnight. But the fog he'd described began lifting. He initiated a conversation again. Asked about my work, remembered details he'd been forgetting. That was the consequence no one could disguise. When medication stabilized under documented supervision, his decline slowed. My stepmother grew quieter. She stopped discussing estate transitions. She stopped using phrases like unpredictable and inevitable. Instead, she focused on routine. Meals, appointments, surface normalcy. But normalcy had cracked. Because once an external system begins verifying, private control diminishes. She didn't confront me. She didn't accuse me of overstepping. She couldn't. Not without drawing attention to the scrutiny itself. So tension lived between us silently, not explosive, just aware. And in that awareness, I saw something I hadn't seen before. She was no longer certain of the outcome, and uncertainty is the first real consequence of quiet intervention. There's a moment when someone realizes the system they relied on is no longer under their control. It doesn't look like panic at first. It looks like overcompensation. After the medication review, my stepmother became hyper-organized in a way that felt almost performative. She printed updated prescription summaries and placed them neatly in a visible binder on the kitchen counter. Transparency, she said lightly one afternoon when I noticed it. I smiled. That's good. But transparency that appears only after scrutiny isn't transparency. It's damage control. The cardiologist had implemented strict electronic tracking. No more verbal authorizations. No more secondary fills without documented transfers. Every adjustment required a written rationale. That meant the informal system she had relied on, whatever its intent, no longer existed, and something else had quietly occurred. During the medication reconciliation appointment, the doctor requested a cognitive screening as part of routine protocol given the confusion about dosing. The results weren't catastrophic, but they indicated mild impairment consistent with medication overload, not advanced heart-related cognitive decline. The doctor noted it carefully in the chart, medication-related cognitive impact. Those words matter legally, because if a will was signed during a period of medically influenced cognitive fog, its validity becomes fragile. I hadn't mentioned the will yet, but but the attorney had already advised me to request a formal review of its execution date relative to documented medication adjustments. So I did, calmly, through counsel. When the request for documentation of witnesses and execution timing reached the household, the shift was undeniable. That evening, my stepmother asked me to stay after dinner. My father had gone upstairs to rest. She stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, posture composed but rigid. "You've involved lawyers," she said quietly. "I've involved safeguards," I replied. "You think I harmed him?" The question wasn't shouted. It wasn't theatrical. It was measured. "I think documentation didn't align," I answered. "And when documentation doesn't align, it needs review." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You've destabilized everything," she said. No. What destabilized everything was inconsistency. What destabilized everything was medication that exceeded prescription logs. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said something simpler. If everything was done properly, review protects you too. That's when I saw it. Not anger. Fear. Because legal review doesn't respond to emotion. It responds to paper trails. Within weeks, the attorney notified us that the will drafted 6 months prior required reevaluation due to concerns about capacity, documentation, and potential undue influence. Undue influence. A phrase that doesn't accuse, but implies scrutiny. My stepmother's confidence eroded in quiet ways. She stopped discussing long-term estate plans. She stopped positioning herself as the sole decision-maker in front of doctors. She deferred more frequently. The system she had consolidated began redistributing authority. And here's the irreversible truth. Once oversight expands, it never fully retracts. You can't fix undocumented dosage increases retroactively. You can't recreate physician notes that were never written. You can't unring the bell of a formal capacity review. Even if her intention had been benign, even if she believed she was managing aggressively for his health, the structure she built lacked transparency. And transparency, once demanded, exposes gaps. The consequences weren't dramatic. No handcuffs, no shouting matches, just legal reassessment, medical correction, power rebalanced. And in that rebalancing, something became clear. Whatever plan had been set in motion months earlier could no longer reach its original conclusion. It was too late to quietly finalize anything, because now everything requires witnesses. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine these things do. There was no slamming door, no raised voice, no dramatic unveiling of printed evidence across a dining table. It happened on a gray Sunday afternoon with tea cooling between us. My father was resting upstairs again, genuinely resting this time, not sedated into silence. His energy had improved enough that he'd started reading in the mornings. Small signs, meaningful ones. She asked me to sit down. Her posture was composed but not defensive. If anything, it was weary. "I need to understand something," she began carefully. "Did you always think I was trying to hurt him?" It was the first time she asked the question directly. I considered it before answering. "No," I said. "I thought you were controlling access to information." Her eyes flickered slightly. "That's not the same as harm." "It becomes harm," I replied calmly, "when dosage adjustments aren't documented, when pharmacies are changed without transparency, when cognitive decline appears during unexplained increases." She didn't interrupt. That surprised me. "I never intended," she began, then stopped herself. "His condition was worsening. I was trying to stay ahead of it." Ahead. The word again. "Ahead of what?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "Of the inevitable." There it was. I leaned back slightly. "The cardiologist didn't classify his condition as immediately terminal." "No," she said quickly. "But heart disease can turn suddenly." "Yes," I agreed, "which is why precision matters." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was exposed. "I felt like you were questioning my competence," she said after a moment. "I was questioning inconsistencies," I answered. "And the will?" she asked quietly. "I questioned timing," I said, "especially if cognitive clarity wasn't fully documented when it was signed." Her composure thinned just slightly. "He wanted security," she insisted. "Security for whom?" I asked, not sharply, just evenly. That question lingered between us longer than any accusation could have. She didn't respond, because the truth was complicated. Estate restructuring often benefits the spouse first, adult children later. That's not inherently wrong, but transparency determines whether it feels protective or strategic. "I would never kill him," she said finally. I believed that she believed that. Intent and impact are not always aligned. "I didn't accuse you of murder," I replied calmly. I insisted on oversight. And that's when the final shift happened. Not in anger, not in collapse, but in recognition. She understood that I would not be repositioned again. Not as anxious a daughter, not as an overreactive analyst, not as a passive beneficiary. I was a documented presence in the process now. Medical systems were watching, legal systems were reviewed, capacity assessments were on record. She wasn't fighting me anymore. She was adjusting to a new reality. "You've changed things," she said softly. "Yes," I answered, "I have, and there's no going back." "No," I said, but I didn't say it with satisfaction, just clarity, because confrontation without heat isn't about winning. It's about establishing boundaries so quietly and firmly that they don't require repetition. And that afternoon, without shouting or spectacle, the balance of power settled into something more stable. Not perfect, not warm, but accountable. It's been over a year since that Sunday afternoon in the kitchen. My father is still living with heart disease. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the structure. Every medication adjustment is documented electronically. Every refill flows through a single pharmacy under physician oversight. Cognitive check-ins are routine, not reactive. He's steadier now, not miraculously healed, just properly managed. And I visit differently, not as a quiet shadow in the corner, not as an anxious daughter hovering over pill organizers, but as an informed presence in the room. My stepmother and I coexist. That's the honest word. There's no warmth like there once was, if there ever truly was. But there's civility. There's protocol. There are systems that protect all of us from ambiguity. Sometimes I catch her studying me when she thinks I'm not looking. Not with hostility, with recalibration, because the version of me she had grown comfortable with no longer exists. The invisible one. The compliant one. The one who absorbs discomfort to maintain harmony. I didn't transform into someone louder. I didn't become confrontational or suspicious of everything. I became documented. That's different. At work, I've always trusted data over assumptions. Now I trust it in my personal life too. I don't apologize for asking precise questions. I don't soften concerns to avoid discomfort. And here's something I didn't expect. I don't feel bitter. There was a moment when I might have, when discovering the empty vials and the prematurely drafted will felt like betrayal layered over grief. But bitterness requires emotional attachment to revenge. What I feel instead is alignment. I align my actions with my values. Truth over comfort, oversight over assumption, protection over politeness. My father once told me while we were sitting on the porch, "You're different lately." "How?" I asked. "You don't hesitate before you speak." That surprised me, because from the outside I'm still calm, still measured, still the numbers girl. But internally, something fundamental shifted. I no longer mistake silence for safety. Silence is a tool, and tools must be chosen deliberately. If I had remained quiet out of fear of being wrong, fear of conflict, fear of destabilizing the family, the outcome might have been irreversible. Instead, I chose quiet preparation followed by structured action. That's who I am now. Not a daughter who reacts emotionally. Not a villain in someone else's story. Not a hero seeking praise. Just someone who understood that love sometimes requires scrutiny. And that accountability doesn't need volume to be effective. It only needs timing. When people hear a story like this, they often expect a dramatic ending. A confession, a public collapse, a clear villain unmasked. That's not what happened here. What happened was quieter. Medication was corrected. Oversight increased. A will was reevaluated under proper documentation. And a family dynamic recalibrated under scrutiny. No one went to jail. No one screamed in court. No headlines were written. But something more important happened. A trajectory changed. I sometimes think about how easily subtle harm can hide inside the language of devotion. How phrases like, "I've got this," and "trust me," can slowly isolate the very people they claim to protect. And I think about how easy it would have been to stay silent out of politeness, to tell myself I was overreacting, to accept being repositioned, to prioritize peace over precision. But here's what I learned. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Calm doesn't mean unaware. And documentation is not aggression. It's protection. If someone is acting with integrity, transparency will never threaten them. It will only confirm them. The most dangerous assumption anyone made in this story wasn't about money or control. It was about me. They assumed that because I wasn't loud, I wasn't watching. Because I wasn't emotional, I wasn't affected. Because I was patient, I would remain passive. They were wrong, and not because I fought, because I prepared. So I'll leave you with this question. If you noticed small inconsistencies in someone you love's care, subtle shifts, unexplained changes, paperwork that didn't quite align, Would you risk disrupting harmony to verify the truth? Or would you hope it resolves on its own? I'd really like to know how you would handle it, because sometimes the strongest move isn't confrontation. It's quite accountable.